Hello again, everyone. Coming back this Thursday to talk about the book that we are discussing, which is How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. And again, if you didn't listen to last week's, or I just want to repeat this, just to make sure everybody's aware what edition I'm working from. I'm actually working from the third edition. I do know there's a fourth edition out there. Shouldn't cause you any problems as far as what we're trying to do here. It wouldn't be and in fact, I think the table of contents is exactly the same. Probably the only difference is some update on some commentary information. That might be just about it. So it's How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, third edition. Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart are the authors. And this week I want to talk about epistles, but specifically chapter 3, dealing with the context. Now we'll talk about epistles again next week. That'll be chapter 4. But this week I just want to deal with chapter 3 about epistles and their context. Now, real quick, so the information that I'm providing for you is information that's beneficial from high school age onward. Now, I wouldn't probably try to teach some of these principles to, obviously to grade school children. They're not going to understand this, but you want to introduce proper techniques, obviously, when you're working with them, give a good example. But definitely when you're talking about studying the Bible from the high school age onward, we've got to evolve into more mature thinking, that's for sure. And we should continually be learning because as a disciple of Christ, the word disciple itself means learner. So we are to be continually learning. And then just from a logical perspective, God is an infinite being. Jesus is an infinite being. So they have things to know about them that is way beyond our ability to know. We have to continually study. Let's put it that way. So there's always more to learn. And then in Scripture itself, you might be surprised at how much there is in there to learn also. If you really start to dig into it, it's really, there's lots of information in there that's really, really pertinent. And a lot of this information you have to understand in order to get the communicator's intent. So I'll come back to this in just a minute. But anyway, here's a real principle, just a simple principle to think about, kind of keep tucked in your mind. And he brought it up in this week, I'm pretty sure, or it may have been in the introduction, I can't remember. But the idea is this: if you're looking at some information and it's not possible that the original audience would have ever thought that way, then you are on the wrong track. So, for example, an ancient audience will never know anything about a computer or airplanes or tanks or things of that nature. It is not possible for that idea to be in the text because the original audience never would have understood that. So whoever's writing to whomever in the ancient times, there has to be something that they are able to connect with them, information. So they're always going to talk in a way that is understandable to that original audience and has pertinence for that original audience. So again, if the original audience could not understand what it is you're proposing, then you are wrong. I mean, it's as simple as that. You have to begin with the original audience's understanding, and then you work from there in order to bridge the time gap for a modern audience. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to use the text responsibly and then and use it in a way that is most profitable for ourselves. So real quick, now, one of our problems when we start thinking about the letters itself, all kinds of scripture, but for the most part, we're dealing with New Testament letters here. Paul's letters. I'll talk about Paul's letters mostly. Is that we have tended to reduce biblical messaging down to a phrase or a sound bite. And I say this jokingly, but we have become very adept at reducing important messaging down to a sound bite that'll fit like on a bumper sticker or on a refrigerator magnet. And so now it's great to see this messaging about God out in the world, no doubt about that. But realize this: when you do something like that, when you pull a phrase out or a few words out or whatever it is you do, maybe just a verse, you are pulling something out of its context. And it is very likely that it will be misunderstood, or the intent of that piece of information, how it fit into a larger context. You will miss what the point was about that information. So we always have to understand a broader context. I'll give you an example later on about how this fits, but just realize that. We often reduce this stuff down to very, very small phrases, and it's done more harm than good. Let's put it that way. Now, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about real quick. Philippians 4:13. I'll read the verse to you real quick. You'll know it after I read it. And you see it on a lot of athletes. They might have this messaging somewhere on their gear or something to that effect. But this is what Paul says in Philippians 4:13. Now again, if I just read this verse, I am going to misunderstand. So he says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Now, a great statement for a specific point that Paul is trying to make. But we have taken this passage and we've made it into just an overall message for just kind of any endeavor in our life. However, this passage, Philippians 4:13, rests in a context that talks about financial aid. Paul is seeking some help from the church. And he says, I know what it is to have more than enough financial resources or whatever resources he needs in order to fulfill his ministry objectives. And he says, I know what it is not to have anything. Regardless of where I'm at, he says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, or through him who strengthens me. The point being is it is very, very specific about his financial situation. And it is not talking about just any endeavor at all. And so this is a good example of one that's completely distorted so many times and taken to be given much more meaning than what I ever intended to. We've added a lot to this text that was never intended by Paul himself. Now, New Testament letters or epistles, often they be called epistles, but they're basically just letters. Now, what we have in the New Testament, you basically have these writings. You have 13 of Paul's letters, and then you have some general letters. And I'm going to talk about the differences between those coming up just in a second. But for an epistle itself, an ancient letter, it had a certain format that it followed. And Paul follows this formatting of the structure of an ancient letter. So in an ancient letter, you're going to have an opening greeting section where Paul introduces himself and then he declares who he's writing to, or to the audience. Let's put it that way. He IDs himself and the audience. So we have, I, Paul, something, to so-and-so group is what happens. After that, you generally have either a thanksgiving or a blessing section. Now, sometimes it can be longer than others, but this is not going to be a real long section. Let's put it that way. But there'll be something there where Paul either expresses some kind of thanksgiving about something, maybe about the people, maybe about God, or he asks for some kind of a blessing. Now, Galatians and 2 Corinthians do have this type of thanksgiving blessing section, but they're very, very short. And in those two letters is where Paul has a lot of his expresses a lot of his frustration, let's put it that way. So even though they still follow the format, there are other letters out there that have larger thanksgiving and blessing sections. Now, these sections really are introductory sections also. So they're not really, they're introducing some ideas that are going to come across later. I wouldn't place too much emphasis on Thanksgiving section unless I was just wanting to talk about how Paul felt about such and such group, or maybe some introductory topics that come up. But as Paul moves along, in any letter you get to the body. So you have an opening section, a greeting section, you have a Thanksgiving blessing section, and then you have the body of the letter. Now in the body of the letter is where your most relevant information is at. This is where it's going to be discussed why such and such problem arose, or how you're supposed to solve a problem, or Paul's advice about something to that effect. So it's in the body of the letter where you have your most relevant information. So that's where you would go to find a lot of things, but you need to understand the complete workings of a letter itself. Now, in the body, and the New Testament letters that we have, real quick, are much longer than the models that we have or the examples we have from the secular world. In fact, in the New Testament, a writing like 3 John would probably be more indicative as far as length and be a greater indication of the length of an ancient letter. That's about how long they were. They weren't very long at all. And so a letter like Romans in the New Testament or 1 Corinthians, these are, and 2 Corinthians too, these are incredibly long letters. They are well outside of the normal framework. Let's put it that way. But Paul has many things to discuss, and he discusses these in the body of that letter that he is writing at that time for whatever's going on. So in the body, you're going to have the author's intention. That's where it's going to come out, why the person is writing. So there'll be addressing of some topics or themes or something like that. In the body itself, you're going to have the most relevant information. This would be where I would consider to be the primary information of Paul's intent or the letter writer's intent. And it could contain, the body itself could contain several topics for sure. And there's always going to be exhortation or instruction in these letters. Now, so I'm expecting, when I start reading letters, I'm expecting there to be command type of phrasing, where you command someone to do something, an exhortation or an instruction or something like that, or an attempt to convince someone to behave in a certain way. You may do it with purpose statements. You may do it with some kind of other conventions. In fact, I'm going to talk about rhetoric coming up a little bit, but we have the exhortation and the instruction is in the body of the letter. And then at the end of the body of the letter, or towards the end of it, there's generally a section where there's some discussion about future travel plans. This generally, a lot of people wrote letters to someone saying, asking how they were doing, and then they might go on from there and tell them that they're making plans to come and visit or something to that effect. So often we have the travel plans, and then you have a closing greeting section. So this is the way the New Testament letters are the framework for them. Let's put it that way. Now, Paul's letters versus general letters. So Paul wrote 13 letters. The general letters would basically be the ones that we call general are, and I want to talk about this, Hebrews, James, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. So now, of those that I just mentioned, the only one that really looks and behaves and is framed like a letter is 1 Peter. The others are not. In fact, Hebrews seems to have a closing section, but it doesn't have an opening section. So it doesn't really fit the letter framework. James has an opening section, but has no closing section. So again, and James is kind of choppy. It doesn't really seems to be more of a collection of sermon ideas or something to that effect. Anyway, and 1 John is the same way. It doesn't have a closing section or an opening section. So even though we call them general letters, they don't really follow the letter format. 1 Peter does, though. Now, all of Paul's letters do follow the letter formatting. And I'm going to concentrate on Paul's letters from here on out about epistles, okay? So that's where we'll be at. We'll just talk about Paul's letters. Now, every letter, all of Paul's letters, were written to a specific audience. It wasn't us, but it was written to a specific audience. Church in Corinth, or Philippi, or Thessalonica, Ephesus, Galatia region, so forth and so on. So he is writing to a specific audience, and it's written at a specific point in history. So the better you understand what's going on in that historical time frame is going to be incredibly beneficial for you. And he brings this up in this book, these letters are occasional. They're occasional. So imagine this. If there weren't any problems at these churches, there would not have been a need to write. But some kind of a problem comes up, or a question comes up, or Paul's in need of something, he begins to write a letter to such and such place. So he gives out his purposes for writing within these letters, these occasions, let's put it that way. So they're not all going to be the same. So the occasion to write to Thessalonica is much different than the occasion to write to Corinth. In fact, some of the information that's in Thessalonica may not even be pertinent to what's going on in Corinth. So this is critical how we start to understand some of this information and how it works within our own lives. Now, so I was talking about how some information may be pertinent for one church and not the other. Here's a really good example. So in Corinth, we have a charismatic problem. You guys know what's going on in 1 Corinthians. There is a problem with the charismatic giftings, especially in the tongues. Is a huge problem. Now, this is the only letter of Paul's letters that addresses this situation. And so, why is it only happening in Corinth and nowhere else? Well, if you understood some historical, geographical information there about the way that these people lived in Corinth, it would probably help you to understand what is going on. So the problem in Corinth with the charismatic giftings is not a problem in Thessalonica. So he doesn't write about that in Thessalonica. But it is a problem in Corinth. Now, there are times also that some information may have been overlooked just because we don't think it has any relevance for our culture. So for instance, like the slave-master relationship that's talked about in the New Testament. Now, I am not condoning this kind of behavior at all. In fact, what happened in the United States was horrible in the 18th, 19th century, 18th, 19th century. There's no doubt about it. That was horrible. And I'm not trying to condone that, so please don't think that way. I'm just trying to bring up something about this kind of relationship that existed in the New Testament. Now, this type of relationship in the New Testament most of the time was nothing like what we had going on in the American South in the 18th and 19th century. What's going on in the American South is much more egregious, much worse than what is ever going on in the New Testament, except for like a military prisoner. So, for instance, if the government of Rome was battling the Parthian Empire and they captured some Parthians, then they would take those, they would enslave those people, and they would be treated rather harshly. But they were like military prisoners. But they were treated in a very harsh manner, very similar to what was going on in the American South, or something to that effect. People who rebelled against the kingdom, the government, or the Roman Empire, were treated horribly. And so they could be enslaved. They're often killed or could be enslaved and treated very, very roughly. Let's put it that way. But by and large, most people were not treated that way. In fact, this type of relationship that is discussed in most times. Now again, I am not trying to condone what happened in the United States. So please do not misunderstand me there. And I pray that I don't miscommunicate this so that it's misunderstood. However, this type of relationship, the master-servant-slave relationship in the New Testament, most often depicts like an employer-employee relationship in the modern setting. So just like our situation, a lot of times in the ancient world, most of these people, it was a job in the day, and you would go home at night. You weren't enslaved in the compound itself, and many of them were paid. And many servants became very wealthy because they had wealthy masters. So it's much, much different, but you have to understand cultural information in order to get that. Now, there's also some information, that's instruction in some of these New Testament letters, that have no relevance at all for a modern audience. So, for example, In 1 Corinthians and Romans, it talks about animals that are sacrificed to pagan deities, and then the meat that is produced from those sacrifices. So Paul basically understands that there's nothing associated with these animals being sacrificed because the deities themselves do not exist, is what he says. However, some people had a hang up because behind these temples where they're doing all these sacrifices, that was where the butcher shop was at. That's the only place you could buy meat. So if you wanted to have meat in your diet, you would have to go to these places to buy these things. Now, we don't have food sacrificed to idols anymore, or animals sacrificed to idols, and go get our food from those types of situations. So this kind of information really is probably not relevant for us most of the time. However, there could always come up time when it could be relevant. So we have to be somewhat sensible about the way we approach these things. But the more you know about the history and culture and other information, the better you're going to be able to discern how this information is usable in our situation, or maybe it may not have a practical purpose, but only in a few instances. Now, let me talk about context. 3 areas I want to talk about: historical, cultural, and literary, real quick. So, historical context. So each area addressed has relevant history. You need to study about the historical information associated with each area. And you need to understand that within the empire itself, the Roman Empire, understanding about those kind of things, government workings. So understanding about how the Roman government worked, understanding about the Roman government, its origin, so forth and so on. And then even going back before that, you should study the Greeks. The Greek influence on the world prior to Jesus. And even after, there's still some influence going on. So understanding these things would be so important in giving you a better understanding of what's going on in the New Testament. Now, also, don't overlook the book of Acts. The book of Acts is a historical writing, so there's a lot of great historical information there that will give you, insights into what's going on in a certain New Testament letter itself. So, learn about the Greek influence on the Mediterranean area because it is impacting our New Testament writings. It's impacting Paul for sure, especially in rhetoric and the way he presents his arguments. Let's put it that way. And then also we need to learn about the Roman Empire and its government working. So all of this historical information is going to give us a better insights, better understanding into what's going on at that time. Cultural context. Now, historical and cultural context often overlap. But you need to realize that there are some cultures within maybe a broader region that may have some information that's important to that region that could help you in understanding maybe some information that's presented in a letter itself. So, for instance, Corinth. Corinth, I know, was a major trade hub. It wasn't exactly setting on a sea. In fact, it set off the sea a little bit, but it had a very strategic point, and because of the dangers of sailing in that part of the Mediterranean area, that Corinth became very important, and it became a major trade hub. And there were many foreign travelers that came through Corinth all the time. So it was a bustling place with a lot of market, a lot of commerce. And another thing, Corinth had many brothels. It was a very lewd place. So some of this information can help you to understand, knowing that, and much, much more can help you in understanding some of the things that are going on in the letter of 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. Ephesus. You need to know information about the goddess Artemis and her cult. Too many people misunderstand what's going on in Ephesians, what's going on in 1 Timothy, because they don't understand, or in 1 John, what they don't understand what is going on in this region with the Artemis cult. And so the more you understand this goddess, the better you're going to understand some of the situations in that area of the Mediterranean world at that time. So it's not the same as the Artemis of the Greek gods. It's a form of that goddess, but the Ephesians and surrounding areas have imported other ideas, cultural ideas, into this goddess of Artemis that's made it more than what it was originally as a Greek goddess. Philippi. It would be very instructive, helpful for you to understand that this was basically an area established by the Roman government, Roman emperor. In fact, it was established by Augustus, where military people could retire. It was land given to them. In fact, Rome is one of the first kingdoms to have a fully professional army. And you could serve 20 to 25 years and retire with a pension. So that was even going on back at those times. But Philippi is a military outpost for basically retired people, and it sits right on the boundary to the north of it are the Germanic tribes. So it's right on the boundary of the Roman Empire. So lots of this information is going to be very helpful in you as you're trying to piece together what's going on in whatever letter that you're reading. So you've got to find good information, or you've got to know where to find good information. Now, what I'm getting ready to say will probably shock you because I'm a preacher, but listen carefully. Commentaries are not the best source. You might think that's weird, but you're a preacher. You use commentaries all the time. No, I don't. In fact, I rarely use them. Commentaries, well, for the most part, if I were to use a commentary, it would be a highly, highly technical one. And the good commentaries that are beneficial to your studies are not, you have to be able to understand, you have to have lots of historical knowledge and cultural knowledge, and you have to have an awareness of the original language in order to be able to work through these. All the other commentaries are really not worth a whole lot. Now, many of them do have historical sections in there, so there would be good maybe to look for that. You can go through there and read some of that, but I wouldn't go out and buy commentaries. Not at all. Generally, they're just they're not the best. In fact, I think you could probably liken it to my childhood days when I was going to school. In my house, we had Britannica encyclopedias. You know, if you did a report, you went and got the encyclopedia. Well, as you continue on in your education and you move into high school and college and so forth, you know these encyclopedias are not very good sources of information. But they were at a very rudimentary level, okay? But they're not real good pieces or sources of information. There are much better places to go and get information than that encyclopedia. Same with commentaries. Most commentaries are usually very, very general, and all they're doing is rehashing some other information that somebody else wrote somewhere in some other kind of writing. So you need to just read, I would read about all the history of Rome and Greece, of Israel, or the area of Palestine, Jewish people, that you possibly could. Get to know their history and what's going on in this. Now, there is a vast expanse of history to know. There is no doubt about that. You think about the Old Testament to the New Testament, through the New Testament, there is a lot of history there to know. But at the same time, realize this. Ancient people did not change readily. So if you start to learn about a cultural situation that was relevant for the 4th century BCE, well, that information is probably going to be good for about 400 years on both sides, because people they just didn't change that much back then. It took a long time. They weren't evolving that quickly. Let's put it that way. So there's a lot to learn, but once you learn it, you can use it very, very effectively. Also, read about social and cultural practices of the day. Now, I'm going to give you a couple resources at the very end, but these writings that, in fact, you can ask me about other resources out there. I'll give you all the help I can. But try to find sources that are not commentaries. Like I said, commentaries generally are just a rehashing of someone else's work, and usually they're too general. And the ones that are really, really good are beyond people in the church. They can only be used by well-educated professionals. And so those are the ones that are really, really good. And the others are really just, you're probably not going to get a lot of benefit out of them. Let's put it that way. I want to talk about the literary context. This is where he spends a good deal of his time. And I can see I'm going over my time limit, so please forgive me. I'm going to try to get going as quickly as I can to get through this. So the literary context. So in our Bibles, we have chapters and verses all the way through. So our Bible is separated out not only by books, but then within the books itself, or the writings, you have chapter breaks and you have verse breaks. Those verse and chapter breaks did not come into the text until much, much later, after the original writings. In fact, the original writings did not have any kind of chapter breaks or verse breaks. In fact, at the very best, there might be a little space that might indicate that there was a break here and we're moving on to something else. At the very best. These ancient documents, they wrote all their words together. Everything ran together. There was not any kind of grammatical, punctuation, or anything in these original writings. So someone later on put chapter breaks in and verse breaks, or they versified. They put verse numbers in there, okay? And I think it happened in like the 17th century or so, and it was by a British guy. I think it was an Anglican priest. I could be wrong, but I know that it's a modern, basically, it's only been around for like 400 years at the most. So that, having said that, just realize, and the way the person did it, if I remember the story correctly, is it was a circuit rider going from church to church preaching, and in the traveling time while he was riding on horseback, he would make these chapter breaks and these verse breaks within this. So it's very arbitrary many, many times. And there's many places where it just doesn't seem to work real well. However, it is a good way to reference things. But just realize that the information that Paul is giving us, it may go beyond the chapter. It may go beyond the verse. And most of the times, it does. So we've got to understand that this doesn't indicate that the informational flow has ceased at all. These are just arbitrary, these verse breaks and chapter breaks. So don't get too hung up about those, all right? Again, the original writings did not even have any grammatical indicators. There was no punctuation in the original writings. So sometimes we have to try to figure out, is this where the sentence ends? Or is it continuing? Or what? It's not always the easiest. Let's put it that way. And then lastly, when we're thinking about the literary context, I mean, there is no other way to understand this except that if you don't have any knowledge about the original wording, you're going to have to look at 3 to 4 translations as you're looking at these passages. And you're going to have to compare them. So you're going to have limitations because you do not know the original languages. And in some respects, you're going to have to put a little bit more effort into it. On the back end anyway. But if you look at 3 or 4 different translations, then you should be in good shape. So that's important. And as you're looking at a New Testament letter, or any writing in the Bible, but New Testament letter, as you're looking at that, sit down and read the whole writing in one setting. Now, it's not too bad to do with New Testament letters, but some of these other books are rather long, but you still should do the same thing in those also. You should sit down with that writing and read the whole writing in one setting. That helps you to understand what is in the entirety of the writing itself. Another thing, try to make an outline of what you're reading. This will help you in numerous ways. So for some things that will come from this is that by making an outline, you are going to try your very best to evaluate the communicative flow, how the information is flowing through the text. As you outline, you're going to be able to separate things out and understand a context, so forth and so on. It's also going to help you to be aware of themes within the body of the letter itself, or topics that come up. So for instance, in 1 Corinthians, there are many topics that come up. First, it's about leadership. Then it's about they're intermingling with prostitutes. And then it's about marriage. And so there's a lot of topics that come up. And a lot of these letters are just like that. There could be several topics, and there may only be one topic. But by doing the outline, it helps you to be aware of these major ideas that come out in these bodies of the letter. And by doing an outline, it's going to help you to understand just the information better itself. You're going to have a better understanding of what's going on. Generally, people get off track because they don't know the information very well. They might make a statement about the letter of Romans, but they're not aware of the totality of the letter of Romans, and so they misinform. So it's better to have a working knowledge of the entirety of the letter. Now, literary analysis. You need to study paragraphs. In fact, you need to think paragraphs. You got to think beyond just the phrase or the verse or whatever else. You've got to think in paragraphs and how paragraphs work together. You're going to have to think about large, progressions of information, much more than just, like I said, a phrase or a verse. Sometimes it could take Paul a little while to get to his point. He is trying to instruct. There's no doubt about it. So you're going to encounter instruction. And he elaborates. Sometimes he gives a lot more information sometimes than what we might want, but he does elaborate. So he helps us. He's trying to help us. Now, again, sometimes it takes Paul a while to get to a concluding thought. And the reason why is because of rhetoric. The way he's doing it, he's trying to convince people. So he has to work through a progression of information or this flow of information in order to try to get the audience to be accepting of whatever it is that he is presenting. That's what his goal is. They don't always accept, but that's what his intent is. So it takes him a while to get to a concluding thought in many instances. And again, make sure that you are looking beyond just a verse. You need to be looking paragraphs before that, paragraphs after. You may even need to be looking at a few chapters to understand what's going on. So let me give you an example real quick of an area of the text in the New Testament that is misunderstood a lot by many people just because they don't think about the broader context. And it comes from Romans 7. And I hear people talk about this quite a bit. And what they want to do is they want to import an idea of spiritual warfare into the Romans 7 text. However, Romans 7 cannot be talking about a Christian. So here's the text that people often cite. So it's Romans 7, 19 through 20. As soon as I read it, you're going to know what I'm talking about. So this is what Paul says in Romans 7, 19 and 20. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep doing. Now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me. That's part of it. Basically the idea is like, I want to do good, but I can't because, I got this sin stuff in me. And we think that's an indication of a Christian struggle or spiritual warfare. I'm here to tell you that chapter 7 of Romans is not talking about the Christian lifestyle at all. It's talking about a person trying to live under the old covenant and to try to live in a way to please God. That's what he's talking about. Now, the reason why I know it's not talking about a Christian is because of the broader context. So if I go back to Romans 6, and I want to look at Romans 6, verse 14. In fact, I would urge you to look at more, but I'm just going to read this real quick so I'm going over on my time. But this is what Paul says in Romans 6, 14. Now, I was talking about something in Romans 7, so Romans 6 could have some information that could be helpful. And Paul says this in Romans 6, 14. For sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under the law, but under grace. It's pretty clear there that sin is not our master when we become a Christian. In fact, this is the great baptism discourse that's going on here. Whenever we enter into this relationship with Christ through baptism, then we're no longer under that dominion of sin, and we are under the dominion of, or the lordship of Christ is where we're at. Now, I want to look at Romans 8 real quick too, because Romans 8 is going to be important because it follows Romans 7. So in Romans 8, verses 6 and 7, this is what Paul says. For to set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. For the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God, for it does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. Those who are in the flesh cannot please God. And he keeps on going. In fact, the rest of it, I want to keep on going. You, however, are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if in fact the Spirit of Christ dwells in you. Anyone who does not have the Spirit of Christ does not belong to him. But if Christ is in you, although the body is dead because of sin, the Spirit of life because of righteousness. If the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his Spirit who dwells in you. And then he keeps on going, talking about living according to the Spirit. My point is this. Chapter 6 has already told us that we're not under the dominion of sin anymore. Chapter 8 clearly tells us that if we don't live by the Spirit's leadings, in fact, if we want to engage in our sinful desires and not heed the guidance of the Holy Spirit and act in accordance with what the Holy Spirit is giving us, then we're not even Christians. So chapter 7 cannot be talking about a Christian lifestyle at all. Chapter 6 has already cleared it up for us, and chapter 8 has reiterated it. You don't live this way if you're a Christian. Now, am I saying Christians won't struggle? No. Christians will struggle. There's no doubt about it. But this is not the text to talk about spiritual warfare. The text to talk about spiritual warfare is Ephesians 6, if you wanted to use one. So Romans 7 cannot be talking about a Christian experience from the larger context. And even if you looked at chapter 7 itself and you started asking different questions, you'd start to see in chapter 7 that we have a lot of old covenant imagery. Just look how many times the word law comes up in chapter 7 of Romans. That is associated with old covenant practices. Think about the word faith. It never even hardly shows up in chapter 7. In fact, I don't think faith is brought up at all in chapter 7. The Christian images that we would associate with Christianity are not in chapter 7. It's all old covenant imagery in chapter 7. It is not talking about the Christian experience. It's talking about a Jewish person trying to live in a way to please God under the old covenant and finding out that they often were frustrated with their own behaviors. Let's put it that way. And then Paul at the very end of chapter 7 tells us the answer. There's a deliverer, and that deliverer is in Christ Jesus. Goes into chapter 8, verse 1. There is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. That kind of idea. So Romans 7, that's a good example of where if we don't understand the broader context and if we don't look at chapter 7 very closely, we can just kind of throw out some ideas there that may not really be relevant for what's going on. In fact, it is not possible for chapter 7 of Romans to be talking about the Christian experience. So, you need to learn about how to work through this information. And a lot of it is learning about ancient rhetoric. Now, I'm going to give you some books here at the end, a couple books that will talk about a lot of what I've talked about throughout this segment. But there is a lot to learn for sure. So become good students of just simple things of the history and the culture of the time. And be good readers. Read slowly and deliberately and start asking the right questions. So now, history and culture, about those two things. I want to give you a couple of resources that would be very beneficial for you. And again, don't use commentaries. Most of the commentaries that I'm sure that you guys are accessing are outdated, and the information in them may not be relevant, and it may not even be very good information, reliable information. So I urge you not to use commentaries, but use other sources. So here's a couple sources that would be very beneficial to you. Now, they're not short reads, but they are very informative. The first one's this: Backgrounds of Early Christianity, the 3rd edition, by Everett Ferguson. Everett Ferguson is actually a church historian out of the Church of Christ a cappella movement. So he's a Restoration Movement guy. But anyway, his book, Backgrounds of Early Christianity, 3rd edition, his name's Everett Ferguson. It's a standard. I mean, all scholars use Ferguson. I mean, it shows up in all the scholarly writings. What he provides in this book is just incredible, an incredible amount of information, and it's so useful in your understanding of what's going on in the New Testament world. So again, Backgrounds of Early Christianity by Everett Ferguson, and it's the 3rd edition. Get the 3rd edition. The second one is this. This one's a newer one, but it doesn't replace the one I just said. In fact, I'd use them in coordination to some degree. But the next one is The World of the New Testament. The World of the New Testament. And it's by Joel Green and Lee Martin McDonald. Now, in this book, it's a collection of essays by many scholars that talk about lots of different social and historical aspects of within the New Testament itself. So, and some of the you might I didn't give you any Old Testament stuff here. I probably should have given you some of that. But if you get through this, I'd start with looking at New Testament stuff and then kind of go from there. And if you're interested in some more stuff, then I can obviously give you many more resources. But those two right there would be a great start for sure in your biblical studies ventures. Now, for next week, I'm going to look at the next chapter. It's chapter 4, and it's Epistles, the hermeneutical question. And so that's the chapter I'll be looking at next week. So if you want to go ahead and read that, and we'll come back and talk about what he means by the hermeneutical question is how do you interpret pieces of information in order to have an accurate picture of what is going on there? That's the idea. So what questions are you going to ask in order to lead you to finding the right information in order to have a correct assumption about that information? So we'll be dealing with that next week, chapter 4. So please read that ahead of time, and I'll be talking about chapter 4 next week. Thank you, and have a great day. Bye.